Hi, my name is Smyrna. Today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the Maritime forest community of Florida's East Coast, more specifically the barrier islands of New Smyrna Beach, Florida. Now, the barrier islands are a small sliver of land located between the ocean and the intercoastal waterway. These can run for many miles down the length of the coastline and provide a very unique ecosystem as well as a forest community. Barrier Islands are relatively new. They're only about 6,000 years old. Now, if you were here at the time of the early Indian settlers, you would expect to see a coastline similar to this, but about 200 miles further out when the water level was much lower. Now, barrier islands are usually formed as contours in shallow spots of the ocean, and over time, storms through wind and waves bring sand that piles up on that contour. And eventually, the sand will break the surface, leaving room for vegetation to take hold and form the barrier island. Now, along the East Coast, we have high energy beaches. This means that they're totally exposed to the ocean and the wind and the waves. This causes quite an often change in the shape of these beaches and the dunes. Now, over time, people have built seawalls and have experimented with dredging to try and reduce this quick changing effect. But over time, I think everyone will realize that nature will have its way in the end. So right now, we're located in the open dune. These are going to be where you're going to find some of your first vegetation. This is still a very high energy area of the beach and the dune. A lot of salt content, high winds, high waves. During large storms, water will reach its way up here and can wipe out a lot of this vegetation that you see behind me. The vegetation that does grow here can be considered some of the toughest vegetation that you're going to find. The soils are very loose soils, as you can see, very loose. They retain no water, high salt content. It's actually quite miraculous that these plants can even grow here. But once they start growing, what happens is the sand will start to build up on the existing plant, and the stalk of the plant will get covered up by sand and become the new roots for the plant. So over time, they become very strong and can be rooted very deeply down into the ground. Some other plants you can expect to find out here on the open dune are the coastal sand spur, which if you've ever been walking around here barefoot and gotten prickly stuck in your foot, that's exactly what that is. So it's best to wear some type of shoe protection while walking around here. Very commonly, you see behind me are the sea oats. These are typically some of the first plants that you're going to see on the open dune. Then you have some other plants like the railroad vine, which is very cool. It travels out onto the sand, sending out long feeler plants so it can find its next stronghold. The plants on the open dune kind of act as a first line of defense for any sort of storm. These dunes, they get built up over time and they start climbing in height, and they protect what's behind it, but over time the plants will grow down from that high spot out into the flats kind of, and these are the plants that are most typically going to disappear over the next few years. As a large storm comes in, a lot of this can be easily wiped out. So we're located right now in an area that's called the interdune. This is kind of the backside of the dune, offers a little bit more protection from the open ocean and the sea. It's still considered a pretty high energy area because the winds are still going to be very strong, and I guess every once in a while you could see some water from the ocean coming in here. But you're typically going to find some of your more stronger plants that aren't going to get displaced as easily. A lot of saw palmetto typically, a few types of cactus, sea grape, still lots of sea oats and stuff of that nature. While the interdune offers a little bit of protection from the ocean, it's still considered a pretty high energy area and a very hard area for things to grow. The salinity in the ground is very high, and the soil, again, is very loose and doesn't retain moisture well. Now, the interdune is where you're going to find some of your first life taking hold into the dunes. Typical residents here would be the gopher tortoise, raccoons, some small mice, nothing too large. This actually tends to be quite a typical place to find gopher tortoises, and because of that reason, is an extremely protected area. Notice I'm standing on a boardwalk, which is completely up over the terrain, which is quite convenient, but it's also because it is unlawful to access the dunes at any time because of the gopher tortoise and because of the conservation that's trying to take place here. So we're located now in what's called the Maritime hammock, or oak scrub to be a little bit more specific. If you were to look at a profile view of a barrier island, you're going to find this at the highest point in elevation, most likely, furthest away from the ocean, furthest away from the intercoastal. Because of the higher elevation, these hammocks tend to have the longer life. They've been settled here for quite some time. They have some more fertile soils. Some typical trees that you'd find. I'm currently sitting in an oak right now, but you'll see some Chapman's oak, myrtle oak, sand live oak, some sand pine / pine for your larger trees. These are very stable communities. As litter accumulates on the ground, there's always some persistent moisture, and shade provided by the trees helps a lot of ground cover establish. So your soils are probably going to be the most fertile soils you can find on a barrier island are in the Maritime hammock / oak scrub area. These areas, because of their long life and their larger vegetation, they're home to quite a bit of animal life. Typical animals you might find in this area would be the beach mouse, a skunk, raccoon, gopher tortoise, of course, lots of snakes. The eastern diamondback frequents areas like this. Because these areas are very stable, they've been around, they're at a high elevation, these were a very popular settling area for the Native Americans if they were to settle on a barrier island, because they have the trees to use as resources, animals to use as resources, and it's the most calm, blocked off from the wind, blocked off from the waves, very more normal setting here in the Maritime hammock. Alright, so we started at the dunes, made our way from the ocean up to the Maritime hammock, and now we finally met the water again at the mangrove swamp. Now the mangrove swamp is going to be a very low energy shoreline, no real waves, high boat traffic, anything of the sort, very calm waters, very chill waters. These are considered to be some of the most densely populated ecosystems on Earth, actually. And before I really get any further into that, I want to discuss something called detritus. Now, detritus is more or less organic matter found floating in the water. Starts off as leaves, bark, organic matter that makes its way into the water. It gets chopped up by small crabs, amphipods, and they leave this detritus in the water, and it floats around, and it really starts the food chain. This is what some small invertebrates feed on. In turn, small fish feed on the small invertebrates, bigger fish onto bigger fish, birds onto bigger fish, and so on and so forth. But a really key part of this whole mangrove swamp habitat is the detritus that floats in the water. Really gets the ecosystem going. It really starts off the food web. Now the soil type in the mangrove swamp is going to be very sulfurous, waterlogged, kind of anaerobic conditions, not a lot of oxygen in the soil. Plants have adapted for this. Most of the plants you're going to find in the mangrove swamp are the black mangrove, the red mangrove, and the white mangrove. And they've all adapted to life in the saltwater in various ways. One very interesting way in which they discard a lot of the salt concentration that they encounter is that they store it almost exclusively in their leaves, and then shed the leaves as time goes on. So this is a way that they are able to live in such salty conditions. Now the reason why the mangrove swamp is such a diverse and densely populated ecosystem has mainly to do with the mangroves themselves. Because of the way they grow and the way they sprout, the different mangroves produce different types of roots. The black mangrove will have small roots that'll protrude up from the ground. The red mangroves will have stem roots that come out, and prop roots, which is what you typically associate with mangroves. Those kind of feel out into the water, creating multiple bases for the plant. And what this does is it creates a lot of structure in the water, in the shallow, and even in the deep water. This acts as shelter for a lot of fish, a lot of smaller fish, crabs, invertebrates in that manner, and a lot of the even larger game fish will find their way up into the mangrove swamps, not only to feed on the smaller fish, but to kind of use as a nursery and an estuary for their young and when they're at younger stages in their lives. And because of this, mangrove swamps are a huge target area for sports fishermen, types of commercial fishing. It's one of my favorite places to be in the whole world. I love to come out here and catch fish. A lot of the popular fish species that you encounter here are the red drum, black drum, spotted sea trout, the snook, tarpon, mangrove snapper. The list really just goes on and on. Pretty much any sort of game fish that you would hope to encounter in inshore Florida, you're going to find growing and feeding here in the mangrove swamps. Because of a lot of the small fish in the area, the mangrove swamps have also become a home to a lot of bird species. You'll find some old mangroves that have gotten really tall and died off over the years, and on top of those, almost always you're going to find an osprey nest. Some eagles will inhabit this area as well. Many great blue herons and a lot of other birds like that. Mainly, you tend to see the ospreys flying around, and pelicans as well, feeding on the large schools of bait that form here in the mangrove swamps. Now, I will note that, especially here in the mangrove swamp area, many years ago, in an attempt to control mosquito population, the mangroves were pretty easily discarded. They were cut down, they were filled in, channels were cut, buildings were built on top of them, and no one really saw any adverse effects immediately. Now, we've kind of done a full 180 on that. There are, in 1996, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection initiated the Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act, and it more or less does not allow you to trim the mangroves in any way, disregarding mangroves, cutting them down for any real estate, any filling. All that is not allowed, and that's very important because as you drain, fill, eliminate these mangrove swamps, you know, a lot of the food and ecosystems here are affected because the small animals don't have a place to grow up and to thrive and to turn into larger animals and to kind of sustain the ecosystem. So there's a lot in part to really help and preserve the mangrove swamp. And you know, being a barrier island on Florida, urban development is probably its largest pressure. People want to fit as many condos and houses into this small sliver of land as possible, and it's really a shame because these small slivers of land, these barrier islands, are just some of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet, and they're some of the funnest places to go. You have anything from surfing in the ocean to hiking, and then to fishing down on the backside and in the mangrove swamps. And I think they've really started to come into a harmony with the urban development and the conservation here to make sure that when they do put up a building, it's in with everyone's best interest and doesn't have any negative effects on the environment, and that there's no more cutting and destroying of the mangroves.